Okay, welcome folks to this time on the sofa with John Lennox. Can I encourage you first of all to look at the bookshop at the back there. There are quite a number of books by several of our speakers, including these two, which John mentioned, Gunning for God this morning, Why the New Atheists Are Missing the Target. And then this second book really came out of the work he did preparing a series of talks on Daniel for the European Leadership Forum about 3 years ago, I guess. They're both big sellers and would reward careful reading. So I'd like to encourage you to make the most of them, and they're for sale at good prices. I'm going to ask John a few questions, and then we're going to open the session up for anybody to ask any question they want of him. So if I could just lob a few in his direction first, just to open our time together. John, going back to this morning, your presentation, you talked about the importance, or your practice, of traveling with a couple of Gideon's New Testaments. So you've always got something available to share with people in terms of accessing Scripture. Have you got any other stories you can tell us about a time when you were traveling where in God's providence you had a Bible or a New Testament on you, you were able to give to somebody which had far-reaching implications?
Yes.
Go ahead and tell us one then. Go ahead and tell us one.
I'm a logic chopper, really, Lindsay, you know. Well, life is often travels with the Bible. Sometimes I describe it, but I suppose one of the most remarkable was something that precipitated my traveling to Russia a great deal from 1989 on. I'd spent a lot of time during the Cold War in the 70s, 80s, in the Iron Curtain countries, particularly East Germany, where I could speak the language, Poland, Hungary. But in, I think it was 1988, I was in Belgium at a conference of mathematicians, listening to fascinating papers on mathematical cryptography. That is, how to keep your financial transactions safe when you go to an ATM and so on. And we were traveling afterwards, and the bus driver, whose bus was full of mathematicians, took a pal to the station. And as a result, we all missed the train because he found himself on the wrong side of a level crossing. And so we were all late and pretty frustrated and angry. So we got a late train, which was traveling from Belgium into Germany. And I got into this train and was a little bit anxious because I got luggage. I was on my own and didn't want to spend much time in the station at Cologne in the middle of the night. But anyway, I found myself in a compartment, and in it, so far as I recall, there was a Belgian woman working for the tourist office, there was a German student, and there were 2 Russians. And I was sitting beside the Russian, so I started to talk to him and discovered that he came from Siberia and was an ecologist. And I was quite surprised, so I said, is ecology a valid subject in Russia? Can you talk about ecology? And he said, actually, we can. And it suddenly occurred to me to ask him, were there other things he could talk about? And he said, yes, we can talk about lots of things. I said, including God. And in that moment when I posed the question, I had an overwhelming desire arose within me, and it never has done before since, to give him a Bible. That was all I could think of, you see, and it was a crazy thought. You're traveling through Belgium at night. Where do you get a Bible? A Russian Bible, because he spoke no English. And kept thinking, you must give him a Bible. And then it slowly dawned on me that some weeks before I'd visited a German publisher, and on his desk he'd had a nice Russian Bible. I picked it up and looked at it, and he said, "Is that any use to you?" Well, I said, "It is, because it's got large print, and my own Russian Bible is very small." So he said, "Take it." And on the train, I found myself wondering, is it still in my suitcase? Because it's been home. Had I taken it out? So I reached up onto the luggage rack, put my hand in, and sure enough, it was still there. I pulled it out, and I handed it to him. And he said, "What's that?" I said, "That's for you." He could see it was a Bible. And he went very silent. He couldn't speak. In fact, he looked as if he was paralyzed. I thought something had hit him. And I said, "What's the matter?" And he still said nothing. And then in the end, he said, "How did you know?" I said, "How did I know what?" He said, "How did you know that 6 weeks ago, the only Bible we've ever seen was stolen from us in Siberia? And we've got this, the first opportunity we've ever had to go outside our country to a conference. We're catching the plane to Moscow tonight. How did you know?" I said, "I didn't know." I said, "But do you believe this book?" And he looked at me and he said, "I don't know." And then he pointed over to the woman sitting opposite, but he said, "That's my wife and she does." And I turned around and she was just beaming. She took the book, she hugged it, she started to cry and said, "Is that really for me?" I said, "Sure, it's for you. Take it home with you." And we talked a little bit and they were gone. And the German student immediately said, she said, "Does that often happen to you?" And I said, "Not every Tuesday." Well, she said, "That's incredible." I said, "Why?" I said, "Think about it. These people have been systematically denied access to Scripture for 75 years. And God can use me as a message boy as much as anybody else." But she said, "If that's the case, I'd better start reading." And she did. I kept correspondence up with her. When I got home, then things really started, because I told this story to Sally. Now, she listened to it, and then she says, "Can you get your diary?" I said, "What for?" She said, "You'll see in a minute." So I got the diary. And she looked at it. She said, "You'd better cancel all this stuff." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because you're going to Russia." I said, "Pardon?" She said, "You better cancel it because you're going to Russia." I said, "Half a minute." She said, "You're going to Russia? How would you go to Russia as a mathematician?" Well, I said, "Just a minute, let's sit down." "No," she said. "How would you go to Russia?" And I said, "Well, there's a exchange scheme with the Royal Society in London and the Academy of Sciences in Russia." So she said, "Ring them up." I said, "Just half a minute, let's calm this thing down a bit." "No," she said, "Ring them up." And for some reason I did. And I said, "It'll be no use because they require forms and endless applications and so on." She said, "Ring them up." I rang them up and the conversation went like this. I said, "I'm a mathematician at the University of Wales in Cardiff, and what's your program with Russia?" He said, "Are you interested in going to Russia?" And I could see there was immediate interest. And I said, "Well, I might be." And he said, "We are desperate for British people to go to Russia because the Russians have insisted that it's 1 week for 1 week. And nobody from the UK wants to go for more than a week. But we want the top Russians out here for months because they're some of the best in the world." So Sally was waving at me. She said, "Give them 2 months." I said, "Are you serious?" So I said, "Well, I might be prepared to come for 2 months." He said, "Okay, you can go. You can go tomorrow if you like. No forms, no nothing." Yeah. And that's how I came to go to Russia. And the implications of that would take hours to tell you. The opportunities of publishing articles in the Russian Academy of Sciences newspaper, of getting on television, of writing all sorts of stuff. It was just opened a vast door.
Well, you're married to a remarkable woman. That's the first lesson to learn from that story.
Yes, yes, 49 years yesterday.
Yeah,
So.
great. Happy anniversary. Well, we haven't got hours, but you did go to Russia, and you went with the person you acknowledged was your key mentor, David Gooding, quite a lot through the 90s. Could you just tell us one or two indications of the impact of the doors that the Lord opened to you, and how you saw him working through you and David's joint ministries, particularly through the 90s?
Well, what happened was that in the 70s, David Gooding invited me out to Spain, where he already had a fairly regular ministry. And he took me under his wing and tried to teach me, quite painfully actually, because he was not soft, and it was good for me. And eventually, when I started going east, I then began to take him. I felt, and he felt, that it might be interesting to do things together. But what happened? I first went on my own, and that contact with the Academy of Sciences was quite remarkable, because I was invited in that first visit for the first time in 75 years to give a lecture in the top university in Siberia on why a mathematician believes in a creator. And it was packed. It was a sensation, actually, and I could spend a long time describing that meeting, but it opened many doors. But there was a reporter at it from the Academy of Sciences newspaper, and she came to me afterwards and she said, "You should meet my boss in Moscow." And I eventually contacted the newspaper and went into his office. And to cut a long story short, he was not pleased to see me. And we discussed various things. He said, "Why are you here? What?" Well, I said, "I have noticed," I had read a few back numbers to see what they did in their newspaper. And they'd been publishing articles against the occult. It was beginning to come in the name of science. And I said, "Have you ever thought of having an article pro-science in the name of Christianity?" And he looked at me, he said, "You're crazy, absolutely crazy." I said, "Why?" Well, he said, in any case, it'd be far too risky. And at that moment, I knew exactly what to say to him. He had a red telephone on his desk. And I said, "Do you see that telephone?" He said, "Yes." And the anger was rising, I could see. I said, "I know what it is." He said, "You know what it is?" He'd never seen a James Bond film, or anything like that. "I know what it is." "What is it?" I said, "It's a hotline." He said, "You're right." "Oh," I said, "I can tell you much more about it than that." He said, and he got up on his feet and was yelling at me. "You come here and you tell me what this telephone is, and you tell me that you know how I got it." I said, "I know exactly how you got it." He said, "How did I get it?" I said, "By taking risks." And he sat down. He said, "Have that article on my desk on Monday morning. I published it." And he did. What he didn't realize was 10,000 people wrote in for more. It was the biggest postbag in the history of the newspaper. And that was where I got David Gooding involved, because this chap was very high up in the literary club and was a trained scientist and all the rest of it, a very bright man.
David was a professor of classics, wasn't he?
Yes, at Queen's in Belfast. And so we began to write together articles, and they got into newspapers of various kinds. The Academy of Sciences newspaper, we put many articles into it. But perhaps the most important ones were off the back of that, we got into the teacher's newspaper. And over a period of about 3 years, we wrote every 2 weeks a 2,500-word article, The Bible and Ethical Education in Schools. And it was designed for teachers to use in the classroom. So it had a bit of Bible text and then leading them seriously through ethics. It wasn't an excuse to write a conversion manual or anything like that. And those went all over the place. And I'll tell you one story that really moved us. I was in Siberia, of all things, giving lectures in a nuclear shelter with a model of the tabernacle, the like of which the Russians had never seen. By the way, I found Russian secular people far more interested in it than British Christians, which is quite a revealing thing. But there was a lady came up and she was waving a newspaper and it had my picture in it. She said, "That's you, isn't it?" I said, "Yes." She said, "You're involved in writing these articles?" I said, "Yes." "Keep writing them." I said, "Why?" She said, "Listen, I'm a school teacher. And I'll tell you what I do with those. When I get the newspaper, I copy it out 30 times by hand. There's no Xeroxes, no access. 2,500 words 30 times by hand. She said, I then put them in envelopes and I go down to the dock, to the port, and send them up the Ob River for perhaps 1,000 kilometers. And teachers collect them at various points. I said, "Why is that important?" She says, "The only literature we've got. Don't stop." And you know, that really spoke volumes. We eventually put all those articles into books, sent them out to the schools, and that's another story. But that work that we did together over those years was absolutely seminal in its effect on Russian schools because they did nothing. Mm-hmm. But they allowed this stuff in immediately after the collapse of communism. So that incident in the train with the Bible sparked off a huge thing that's even going on today.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm glad you could share it today, and thank you, because I remember in the 90s we couldn't.
No.
Because of the security situation. So we're privileged to hear a fleshed out story today. Subsequently, in remarkable circumstances, maybe you don't have time to talk about how Sally prayed you into moving from Cardiff to Oxford. But when you were there, God opened some amazing doors for you to, first of all, dialogue with Richard Dawkins, and then other people like Christopher Hitchens and Peter Singer, the Australian thinker and atheist in public spheres. Can you tell us a little bit, John, about how you've approached these dialogues and how you engaged with these people? Because this morning you were talking about the importance of trying to engage with people and meet them where they are. Did it cost you a lot in terms of time, energy, work, preparation to engage with them? And how did you go about it? Perhaps you could just tell us about the first dialogue with Richard Dawkins.
You know, the first dialogue with Dawkins was, for me, a huge mountain to approach, really, because this kind of thing is formidable from many points of view. First of all, he had refused for many years to legitimize, as he put it, people like me by debating them. Secondly, it was very remarkable how it came to happen through a friend of mine in Alabama, of all places. I mean, the debate took place in Alabama, which is amazing. And my friend Larry Taunton very cleverly pitched the thing to Dawkins that the Deep South would like an experience of this Oxford debate, you see. And Dawkins, of course, had never heard of me, but in the end, he was persuaded that I was pretty innocuous since he'd never heard of me. So he agreed to do it. But preparing for it took many months, virtually full time. I had to read masses of stuff because I felt that this is going to be unique. I sensed that. And secondly, the whole world is watching. And the so-called new atheists led by Dawkins have gained a huge platform. And if nobody stands up to them, they win by default. But if somebody stands up to them and blows it and makes a mess of it, it'll be terrible. So I sensed that there was a huge weight off the defense of the gospel. Can I make Christianity credible against the background of this formidable, in one sense, attack? And I knew that a lot of people would be watching. Well, people prayed in a remarkable way. There were many prayer meetings going on around the world before and after that debate. But I only know of one way of approaching these things, and that is to go through the arguments meticulously. And I wrote out dozens and dozens of different answers to different scenarios and all this kind of stuff. And you could have done that forever and a day, because this kind of a debate makes demands. I don't do them anymore, and there's a reason for that, which you can come to afterwards. But I had to prepare intellectually, mentally, and so on. But the best bit of advice I got was from Nigel Lawson's son, Dominic Lawson, who's a leading newspaper columnist. And I met him, and I said, can you give me any advice? And he said, look, he said, whatever you do, say what you want said, no matter what he says, you see. And that was important, because it's very easy to be deflected by the first thing anybody else says. And in the end, I felt buoyed up, because I knew I was way beyond my reach, out of my depth in that sense, very far out of my depth. But I felt very strongly that this needs to be challenged. And it was true in the first century. It's still true. I believe it's true. Therefore, I mustn't be ashamed of it. And whatever happens, if they make a complete mess of me, still I'm going to try and stand with God's help. And he did enable me to stand. And one of the very encouraging things over the years is that many people who came to faith directly through the debate. It's amazing. I still get letters about that debate, because, of course, it's on the internet now. And several million people, I believe, have watched it, which is just phenomenal. But they're very hard work. And atheists have now come, atheists, not to like them anymore, because a moderated discussion is much better and more effective than a confrontational debate. But that's just a little bit of the
now,
background to it.
In terms of your style, what other people have commented on as they've seen
My
you.
style. Have I got a style?
Yes, yeah. Well, one of the distinctives is rigorous, careful preparation, months even reading all of Dawkins' material.
Yes.
So you could take him on at his strongest point of argument.
Yes.
That was one. So very careful preparation.
Yes, you've got to take them seriously. He made the mistake of not taking me seriously, which is very obvious. But if we're going to deal with these people, we must take them seriously.
The second distinctive is gracious but fearless defense of biblical truth is a hallmark of your approach. But the third that some people have commented on is that you've actually been very gracious in the way that you've engaged sometimes with people who are very hostile. And one of these people himself commented on this, Peter Singer, after your debate with him in Sydney. Would you like to share a little bit about your interaction with him and how he responded? And for the implications for us in terms of dialoguing with people with grace rather than out of anger.
All of this is an attempt, really, to carry out what Paul says, that we're to speak the truth in love. Some people are very good at speaking the truth, but they lose the plot when it comes to graciousness and so on. Because they feel that if you show any grace, you're compromising truth. That's sheer nonsense. And it has to be learned. There's no question about it. We have to learn our approach. But I have found over life that you lose nothing by being gracious so long as you're truthful. But if you're truthful and gracious, you get a lot further than if you're being truthful and not gracious. And Peter Singer was interesting because Peter Singer is an ethicist with with views that I'm diametrically opposed to, undermining the sanctity of life. And he's the person that wrote something like, a newborn baby is of a damaged child is of less value than a pig, a dog, or a chimpanzee. That kind of statement. And I got some horrific letters from Christians, sadly, before I debated him, telling me to go for the throat and eviscerate him and all this kind of stuff, you know, it's desperate. But I wondered, how do you approach this? Because his ethical views I abhor. The topic of the debate was, does God exist? And in the end, having prayed about it and thought about it in great detail and read endless stuff, because he's a prolific writer, I started something like this. I said, we're all well aware of Peter Singer's views in ethics, and I abhor them, actually, I'll be totally honest. But what I notice is that they, in a way, are a logical consequence of his atheism. And it's his atheism we're here to discuss. In other words, the basis rather than the product. But I said, even before we get going, I've been reading his books. And one of them I found very challenging as a Christian. You could have heard a pin drop. I said it's a book called The Life You Can Save. And I said, as a Christian, to any Christian here and anybody else, I'd recommend that you read it. And then moved on. At the end, he came up to me and he put out his hand. He said, thank you. I said, for what, Peter? He said, you treated me tonight like no other Christian I've ever met. And he said, tomorrow night I'm giving a very special lecture, and I would like you to be the guest of honor. And I just felt, you know, there is a rightness. I didn't compromise on anything, but it got in, something got in. And I just feel we need to learn. As I look around the world, I suspect that many Christians don't engage simply because they've tried before. They've got cross with people who disagree with them. That has just disrupted everything, and then they don't try again.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask you a couple of questions
You
from this morning?
Go ahead.
You said if you could, you'd abolish the word apologetics. And you like the term persuasive evangelism.
Yes.
What's the difference?
Well, there's no difference. It's just that the word apologetics, particularly in America, they think it's a subdivision of Philosophy 101. And so they say to me, oh, I hear you're into apologetics. I say, what on earth are you talking about? Aren't you? Oh, no, that's for clever people. And they think that apologetics means being a high-powered academic and able to answer all the questions. Now, when Paul gave his apologia, his defense of the gospel, the main thing he talked about was his conversion. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, he did deal with arguments according to his ability, which was very considerable. But it's just getting people away from the feeling apologetics is not for me. Mm-hmm. And often people don't engage because they can't answer the questions. And then they feel, oh, those who are into apologetics can answer those questions, rather than doing the work that they need to do to start to learn to answer a few questions. So I'm not against the activity, I'm just against the word that divides Christians up and gives people an excuse for not engaging with the culture.
Now, the word persuade,
yes,
related to evangelism, is one of the most common words in the whole of the Acts of the Apostles.
Yes.
Paul persuading people.
Yes, that's right.
What is persuasive evangelism? What are its hallmarks? And should we all be engaged in it?
Well, I think we should all be engaged in it. There's no option. when Peter talked about everybody being ready to give an answer to those that ask you. I said this morning very briefly that he imagines dialogue. It's one-on-one, really. And there's no evidence in Scripture that they ever imagined a silent Christian, unless there's some physical reason for you to be silent. And if you ask yourself, why were people persuaded? There are a whole number of factors. I suspect the first was the authenticity of the apostles' lives. They, as somebody has put it, they outlived the pagans in the quality of their lives. Secondly, there was the conviction of the truth of what they said, because it related into things that the people already understood. Now, we're going to look at that a bit tomorrow.
Right.
But they built bridges. You know, the apostles read the daily newspaper, if you see what I mean. Mm-hmm. They understood where people were at, and so they could relate the gospel to that. And it seems to me that is crucial. They didn't speak, the Germans have a wonderful word for it, die Sprache Kanaans, the language of Canaan, that only the Christians understand. They spoke an ordinary, plain, straightforward language, Greek or Hebrew, or whatever it was, or Aramaic, in a way that the people around could understand. Mm-hmm. And they did demolish arguments. So I think persuasive evangelism is communicating the message in a way that persuades people, but doesn't coerce people. Mm-hmm. There's a vast difference between persuasion and ranting at people to coerce them, which will never work.
And it was Adolf Harnack, the German historian, of course, who said that the early church grew for two reasons: that they outlived
Harnack,
and
yes,
out-argued the pagans. This morning, you made two very strong points from the early chapters of Acts about how Paul balanced communication about the Christian message being a supernatural message, or given to us by a supernatural God. And secondly, the exclusivity of the gospel. Could you make one or two suggestions for those of us who want help in this respect as to how we could effectively communicate in our context how the gospel is supernatural and how it's exclusive? Any recommendations about lines we could pursue?
Well, the world I inhabit, taking the supernatural question first, the big difficulty is not the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. It's that people won't even consider it because they don't think such things are conceivable or allowed by the laws of nature. So there are two things that have to be done. And not everybody can master the arguments, although some of them are relatively easy. And that is to get across the idea that any sensible understanding of the laws of nature does not forbid the supernatural in principle. And then that clears the way to give evidence for the resurrection of Jesus in particular. Now, I can do a bit of shameless advertising.
Go ahead.
Because the man behind a lot of this stuff is David Hume, the Scottish Enlightenment philosopher. And when I was debating Christopher Hitchens on one occasion, I mentioned the resurrection. He said, oh, well, Hume has put the nail in that and shown it's impossible. So I just stopped him. I said, Christopher, I can't remember my exact words, but they were to the effect, you don't know what you're talking about. Hume was wrong. And I can demonstrate that very quickly. And I did publicly. And afterwards he said, that was pretty heavy stuff. I said, yes, it was. He said, I'd never heard it before. I said, no, because you've been listening to Richard Dawkins, and he doesn't know what he's talking about either. So we had a very good conversation about it. Now, because David Hume figures greatly in his arguments against the supernatural, I decided to, at the end of the book you've got there, Gunning for God, I have 2 chapters at the end of that One is to deal with the in-principle argument, and then the other is to look at the resurrection, but through the eyes of David Hume, because David Hume famously wrote about why should we believe a witness? How strong should it be, and so on. And so I took all those criteria and applied them to the resurrection in a way in which I don't think has been done before. But the two arguments are there, and I reckon they're pretty accessible, but you have to think carefully about them. The exclusivity question, that there's only one way. Often the objection comes and says, that was all right 20 centuries ago. We now live in a tiny, multicultural, pluralistic world, and we can't afford that kind of stuff. But just half a moment. The early apostles preached the uniqueness of Christ not because they were unaware of multiculturalism and pluralism, but because they were more aware of it than we are. I mean, in Wales, there aren't too many temples to Aphrodite, at least not obvious ones, and Zeus and Baal and so on. They lived in a world that was absolutely full of pagan religion and philosophical thinking and various schools and so on. And they knew about them. And in that context, they held to the uniqueness of Christ because it was the only place they found salvation. And if water's only to be found in that tap, that's the tap you tell people about because everything else is useless. So it's the exact opposite reason. It wasn't because they hated their fellow men, it was because they loved their fellow men that they says here is the unique source. So that's the way I would begin to approach that. There are other things, of course, to be said, because at the back of your question is the age-old thing that comes up all the time. Aren't all religions effectively saying the same thing? And that's a very common thing today. And people feel it's arrogant. Why would you want to be a Christian? And often I give lectures on science and faith in God, and people listen. They say, that's all marvelous. It looks as if there's a God, but you believe in the Christian God. Mm-hmm. And I always welcome the question because I say, okay, yes, it's a perfectly valid question, and science doesn't answer it. But science isn't the only way to truth, and that's a very important thing. Mm-hmm. There are other things like history and experience and so on. And I said, let's just take the three monotheistic religions that we know best in the West. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. They make claims. How are you going to deal with them? Well, I only know of one way of dealing with these things, and that is the basis of evidence. Now let's take a central claim. Judaism said that Jesus died and didn't rise. Islam says he didn't die. And Christianity says he both died and rose. Those are three mutually exclusive historical assertions. And I say they cannot all be true. And their adherents of these religions say they cannot all be true. It's very interesting when it comes to discussing in public the differences between religion. I find that the difficulty is not with the representatives of the religions at all, it's with the secularists, who want to say that they all say the same thing when their own representatives say they won't. It gives an opportunity to discuss the differences, and I always end up by pointing out that the flip side of the uniqueness of Jesus is that he's not in competition with any other religions. I got this from David Goody years ago, and I found it inordinately helpful. Jesus Christ competes with no one else. Why? Because he offers me something that none of them do. And then you can explain forgiveness, peace with God, and all the rest of it, and the gospel. So the religions question and uniqueness question, almost inevitably, I get an opportunity to explain the gospel.
So this is fleshed out in Gunning for God, if you'd like to get a copy.
To a certain extent it is, yes.
I'd like to, if we had time, to have asked to draw you out in your comments about suffering from this morning, but we don't have time, and I want to give opportunities for folks from the floor to ask questions. As they're thinking about what to ask, I'm going to ask you just one last one. The last few years, I've heard you speak a lot about having confidence in the gospel. The need to have confidence in the gospel. In a generation when so many believers in our churches are really struggling, they're assaulted by secularist views, and often their confidence is dented. What would you say to church leaders here trying to equip the members of the churches to have confidence in the gospel, or any of us who are believers here, about how we might develop a stronger sense of confidence in the gospel and the courage that you referred to amongst Daniel and his friends in Against the Flow?
What I would say to this is this. In my experience of life, authority in the pulpit is directly proportional to engagement with people in the gospel. In other words, there is danger, and I've seen it again and again, of people losing contact with reality. And they're preaching in churches, they're teaching the Bible and so on. But it loses its spiritual authority because it's not anchored in constant dialogue with people out there. If a few days go by or a few weeks go by and I don't have an engagement conversation, I feel I'm beginning to lose out. Because we cannot lead people where we haven't been ourselves. And they can tell. You can tell within 2 or 3 minutes of listening to a talk in church whether there's anything real behind it or not. And I think we all need to seek the Lord because we're all sinners and imperfect and have failed in this. But we need to raise the bar in certain places vastly higher than it's been, because the non-Christian world will vote with their feet all the time. And we need to be aware of that. I stressed this morning the word grew and the churches grew, and it was the word out there. It wasn't the word in the churches. That grew inevitably. But it was the word working in society and resulting in people coming to faith in Christ and coming into churches. And I would simply encourage people who have the awesome responsibility, and it's a huge privilege, to ask themselves, and they can speak freely because I don't know you. Am I getting this sermon off the internet or just hauling a few notes out of the cupboard and so on? Now, we all use past material. I do it all the time because it's but it's keeping it fresh. And the freshness comes in constant discussion with people. That's one of the main things I would say. I mean, it sounds a hard saying, but we've got to ask ourselves, we need people who'll give us a reality check. And I would ask you who preach, who criticizes what you say? Who evaluates it for you? Well, if you've got a wife, that's very useful. My wife's my best critic, but you need more than that. And in my earlier days, one of the great things was, and I see Professor Hawke sitting here, we used to be involved in a Bible study together. And when we ran that, we would have a session having a post-mortem. And it was a very helpful thing to do. I sense that many people have grown into the ministry and they've risen way above criticism. And now they are so anxious and nervous in case anybody, well, they've lost it, I'm afraid. Mm-hmm. I'm being brutally honest here, but I think we need to, Lindsay.
Thank you. Well, I suppose one of the things is to pray each day, Lord, lead me to the people in whom you're working, that you want me to speak to. That's how Francis Schaeffer used to pray each morning.
I think that's exactly right. Rather than having it as some sort of cramping, narrowing thing, that the joy of it, and if you're not led to anybody, that's fine. Mm-hmm. But to be constantly looking for opportunities, and therefore, and I'll probably speak to this a bit more tomorrow, but to be aware of what's going on so that you've got subjects to talk to people about. Mm-hmm. Years ago, I'll say this tomorrow.
Okay. Well, let's take a few questions, because the issue of engaging with the culture and society. I think Oz and Michael Green will be taking up in talks over the next 2 days and in the question and answer session. Just 2 rules for questions. Keep it short. And if you have a question, ask, do I think this will be helpful for the majority here, rather than it just being a personal question, because we don't have much time. So please try to ask questions you think will be of value to many others who are present here.
And address them all to Lindsay.
Sorry?
Address them all to Lindsay.
Does anyone have a question they want to ask John, please?
Thank you, John. I know Lindsay was converted, but can you take us back to the beginning and something about your background? How were you converted?
In the same way as everybody else is.
Yeah, in detail.
It's interesting that I get asked that question. The story of my conversion is infinitely less important than the fact that I'm sitting here believing that Jesus is the Son of God. And I mean that seriously. I grew up in a culture in Northern Ireland where people were very interested in the details of it. I can't really remember. You see, my parents were believers, my grandparents were believers, and their parents were believers. And looking back over 70 years, I can't remember exactly what were my experiences as a child and what were my parents' experiences. And so, as a result of that, I was a huge doubter. I got converted a whole lot of times. I'd go to this camp and oh yes, I got it now. And then I'd hear preachers saying, are you sure you've got it? And then I wasn't sure I got it. So I get it again. And it was very sad, actually, looking back psychologically. It's not the way the Lord treated people. But the crucial thing is, yes, there was a time, clearly, when I came to trust Christ. I suspect it was earlier. That I'll find out in heaven all about the details, so I'll be able to answer your question in heaven. But the main thing for me sitting here today is, look, I believed that Jesus Christ was the Son of God yesterday. I still believe it today. Am I building up my faith that I'm going to believe it tomorrow? And it's that livingness of it, rather than the fact I don't spend much time telling people I was born physically. I hope I don't need to. Good question, by the way.
Question to ask.
There's one back there I can see.
They're always asking these trick questions in Merthyr.
As a student, I often find having discussions with friends, I'm somewhat of a novelty intellectually defending the Christian faith. And they're very happy to have discussions and enjoy the novelty, but you can't really move beyond that spiritually. How do you avoid being an academic and intellectual novelty?
There's always the question of moving people from the abstract to the concrete, from the intellectual to the personal. If people come with questions, we have to genuinely answer those questions. But very often, as you get older, you get experience that people are just repeating one question after another. And I can recall many incidents with people. I get the opportunity these days to talk to some very high-powered business people. And one man wanted to talk about Christianity, and he spent an hour and a half firing one question after another. I didn't get opening my mouth until I stopped. And I said to him, do you know, you haven't listened to a single thing I said. You're not remotely interested in it. You're jumping from one question to another. Now, unless you begin to get serious, you're going to get nowhere, and I'm certainly going to get nowhere. That resulted in getting him into, believe it or not, a Bible study, where we made much more progress. And I think as a student, it's important to engage in these late-night conversations and so on and so forth. But sooner or later, we get the sense that more needs to be said. And very early on, I learned this in quite a dramatic way when I was a student. And I was asked at dinner in Cambridge one night by somebody what I thought, why I believed that Jesus rose from the dead. And I tried to explain it quite quietly because I was surrounded by big guys like Lindsay. They were all members of the rugby club. And as I got quieter and quieter, the silence grew round. It was very difficult until a chap 2 or 3 down lost his temper. He thumped the table and all the knives and forks jumped. And he said, that's the most absolute nonsense, the worst I've ever heard, and all this kind of stuff. And I thought, oh dear, what do I do now? He was poo-pooing the resurrection. So what I said was this. I said to him, tell me, I said, you feel very strongly about this. He said, yes, I do. I feel very strongly about it. So what was I doing now? I was discussing his emotion and his reaction, not the evidence for the resurrection. You feel strongly. Yes, he said, I do. So I said, tell me, what did you make of Paul's evidence when you read it? He said, what? I said, you heard me. What did you make of the evidence of Paul when you read it? He said, I never read it. Well, I said, where's the strength of feeling coming from? I said, aren't you a serious person? So I invited him back for coffee. Half an hour later, he said this. He said, the trouble, John, is actually my parents shoved this stuff down my throat and I don't want to believe it. I said, right, that's the first honest thing you said tonight. He was converted within half an hour. He's still serving the Lord. In other words, we got through that constant questioning by talking about reaction. Now, you have to be very sensitive when you do that. Sometimes I do it very gently. Sometimes I do it quite forcefully. But you have to learn to move beyond just the factual content with, well, this is implications. What are you going to do about it? And often the easiest way just to close this with is to say to somebody, suppose, we've had a long argument now, a long discussion, suppose I could convince you or persuade you that Jesus is the Son of God. Would you be prepared to trust him? Ah, well, and then it comes out honestly, and you can deal with that. You talk about that then. Okay?
One last question. One more question.
What's the best way or method of sharing the gospel in the world for people who are not with no roles, or with no, I'm not a pastor or anything. I don't have any, positions of authority. You know what I mean? What can people like myself? What's the best way to evangelize for people without any official roles or positions?
All people are very different. You can't give one method. But let me make just a few brief comments. You don't have to be a pastor to witness. If you are a pastor, you should be witnessing. But as Christians, we are called, all of us, to be witnesses. Now, Peter gives us a clue. He says you should be answering questions. Well, you can't answer questions you don't get asked. So you have to be a question provoker. That's what you have to be. Get people curious. Now, one of the ways of doing that is learning to listen. I was taught that I've got 2 ears and 1 mouth, and I should use them in that proportion. Now, Irish people, I'll not speak for the Welsh, Irish people have a considerable difficulty with that. They should have been given 2 mouths and 1 ear, but they weren't. And listening to people. Now, how do you do that? Well, my intellectual hero from the ancient Greek world is Socrates, who was famous for asking questions. And learning to ask questions is one of the most interesting things. You meet somebody new. I have a little rule, which I break frequently because I'm Irish usually. But meet somebody new. Try this the next time when you meet somebody new. And I'm talking to you specifically who asked the question. Keep asking them questions until they ask you one. Some people find that virtually impossible because they're so full of a message they want to get rid of and things they need to share and so on, that they don't know how to listen. And if you do that, now what questions? It's not, I'm suggesting you say to them, what do you think of Ezekiel 37? No. It's, tell me a bit about your story. Tell me a bit about your life. People love talking about themselves. And you begin to find out a bit about their friends and their family. Don't ask them what they do, first of all. That's a common mistake that, and it particularly happens in the world in which I work, at the university. What do you do? But try to get to know who they are and what interests they have and what hobbies they have. I mean, the dinners we have in our college at Oxford, I sit beside people and I say, well, you're a professor of X. Tell me, what do you do in your spare time? And they all light up and they say, well, I'm into applied basket weaving. How fascinating. And you start talking, and then as you get an opportunity, you begin to probe. Something may have happened. Like today, there's been an explosion in London on the tube. Just take that as an example. And say, look, we're all faced with this kind of thing every day. Have you got any resources that cope with that? And listen for their answer, and don't give yours until they ask you. The crucial thing is to hold back and hold back and hold back and hold back. And then you'll discover you've made a friend. And most people I speak to today, when I ask them, tell me the story of how you became a Christian, it's through friendship. And all I'm saying is giving practical advice on how to make friends. Years ago it was said to me, if you want people to find your faith interesting, you had better be interested. I said, in what? In everything. In other words, never become a monomaniac. You know, the sort of person that can only talk about the gospel. And you notice sometimes, this is another thing some people have to learn, especially Celts, is not to change their voice when they're talking about the gospel. It is remarkable. It is remarkable. You listen to people, they talk about politics, football, and then when it comes to the gospel, I've got a message for you. And they frighten people to death. I know this is very simple and practical, but I tell you, practicing talking about your faith in Christ in the same tone as you talk about Cardiff Arms Park or politics or anything makes a huge difference, because then people see it's a natural part of your life. Does that make sense? Good, you know what to do.
Well, that's a challenge for those of us who come from Merthyr, because we shout about everything. But it was T.S. Eliot, the great poet, who once said of Jesus, he was the man who never stopped asking difficult questions. So in our evangelism, the art of asking questions is a lost art. In part, it has to be done alongside preaching and gossiping the gospel. And we'll look at that issue in the evangelism track.
Can I say one more
thing?
thing?
Go ahead.
To the young man who kindly asked the question. One of the things that stops us doing what you want to do is the fear of not being able to give an answer. Now, I want to say one thing about that. If somebody asks you a question you can't answer, say so at once. And just say, you know, I've never heard that question before. I'm sorry. I don't know what to say. But I tell you what, I would love to go away and think about that, because it seems to me that's very interesting. Can we have coffee next week? You'll never lose face by doing that. You'll more than likely see them become a friend, because it turns out that you're human. You don't know everything, and you've admitted it. It is so important. I get questions all the time that I can't answer, and I have to think about them. And that makes you human. Be vulnerable, be human, but use that as an opportunity to think about it and come back and make a little step forward and so on. If they ask you another, then on it goes. Sorry.
Thank you. Well, a good exercise for all of us is to go and read the Gospels and list all the questions that Jesus asked. At least 70 in the Gospels. So he was a master of question and answer in the way he dialogued with people alongside his preaching. Well, thank you, John. That was a great hour. Take a break now, folks, for half an hour for some coffee or tea? Is it Chris? And is it 15:15? Should we
Half
say
an hour
20?
now for tea and coffee. Before you go, though, shouldn't we give them a round of applause?